Well, hi everybody. I'm Dr. Joel Hunter, completely unprepared, obviously, for today's session, and glad you're here. Really excited to get into really the meat of our class now. We just went through, what was it, Consequentialism and Kantian ethics, two big ones and two difficult ones. And the thing that struck me about looking at your quiz is just how well you did. That was tough stuff, and the average was as good as the previous quiz, actually a little better, thanks to me because I made a mistake. Well, I'm glad to see more folks rolling in. If you have questions when we're going through the material, of course, you can always just ask that question live, and I'll answer it right on the fly. It helps me if you put your name in all caps before you put your question. So if you would do that, that'd be great. So yeah, let's get right to it. You know, last week's Periscope was an hour long, and I'm not going to do that again. That was way too long. I'm going to keep my tangents very, very brief this time, I promise, and stick to the material, what you need to know. I don't want to do another hour broadcast. So I'm going to aim for between 30 and 40. We'll see how it goes. Okay, so let's talk then about this previous quiz. Oops, sorry, I did not do the right slide. I did the last slide. Doesn't help to do the presentation backwards. No, it doesn't. Let's try that again. Here we go. Okay, let's talk about the third quiz then. This was a remarkable performance. You all scored an average of an 82%, which is really quite good on difficult materials. So you all are really taking this seriously, certainly the majority of you, and really proud of the performance here. So let's talk about some specific questions that gave you trouble, and like last time, I want to be able to use these to illustrate ways in which to improve your quiz performance going forward. So some common problems that I was seeing. So let me get my notes, and then we can talk about these. I'm actually going to point to some places in the book this time. I'm going to read from the book. So if you have your book with you or nearby, grab it, and then you can follow along with what I'm doing. Okay, so let's talk about question number 1. So I'm going to look over here to read, so pardon the side there. But suppose X doesn't pay all their income taxes. Which ethical position opposes this, no matter what the reason given by X? So the interesting thing about this problem was only 61% of you got it right. I'm not sure why you didn't see this as, or 29% of you said it was consequentialism, but consequentialism only looks at results to justify actions. So it does not, it is not really concerned with issues like integrity, which that is a more that is more relevant. That kind of value is more relevant to this question. So it's always wrong to not pay your taxes. The best answer here is the Kantian scheme, for the very reason I gave. If you apply the principle of universalizability from Kantian ethics, you'll see why this would be the correct answer. Because if X acted in such a way that X's actions could be applied to everyone, society would break down. So under Kantian ethics, this is why not paying your income taxes would always be wrong, no matter what reason you give. Now, it may be perhaps excusable, if it's not a categorical imperative, but there would be a significant moral cost. So Kantian ethics says then that this is always wrong no matter what, not consequentialism. Okay, next is number 9, I think. Yeah, so this one, I gave you an argument, or I gave you part of an argument, and your job was to fill in the missing premise. So the second premise then, what you have to do is you have to link the first premise up here, you have to link the concepts of the first premise to the concepts of the conclusion. And the linking terms are, in the first premise, it is misery, results actions that result in misery. So that concept needs to appear in the second premise, as well as then the question of self-interest, motivation and self-interest. So misery and self-interest are what tie the two claims together and what gets you from the first premise to the conclusion. So that's what you should be looking for. Now all I'm doing there is giving you a linguistic clue. That's not even the reasoning behind it, but it is a clue as to how to sort of narrow down the options. And so when you look at it just on those terms, then the one premise that should stand out to you is that third one. So avoiding misery is self-interested. Okay, so you see how that connects then? The first premise of we always try to avoid actions that result in misery. Suppose that's true. Then if we avoid misery, we are, according to the second premise, avoiding misery is self-interested. So what I can infer, if those first two premises, if those premises are true, is that we are always motivated by self-interest. Okay? You see how that works? Well, that's, you got a similar kind of problem on this quiz. The difference is, I'm going to give you a full argument. It's a longer argument, but I'm going to give you a formal argument like this, and your job is going to be to complete the analysis. So it's a fill-in-the-blank question with multiple options to choose from, but what you're trying to do is complete the analysis so that the analysis is correct. So I'll get to that in a little bit. I've actually got it for you here in this presentation. All right, so let's look at the next one, which was, oh, by the way, let me just go back for a second. On this one, this question, I think more than any other, predicted your performance on the quiz. So the people who got this right was 79%, which if you take out my error on one of the questions, on question 18, that's exactly what you all got as a class on this quiz. So this one was actually, interestingly, a prediction or a predictor for the class average on the quiz, for what it's worth. I like stuff like that. Okay, next is number 10. Sorry, number 10. So consequentialist theory asserts that, and here you have to select multiple answers. Kind of surprised by this one because the answer for this one is in the early part of the chapter. So only 59% of you selected the two correct answer choices. Interestingly, 37% of you also chose, or instead chose, the final answer. It's wrong to violate someone's rights. Consequentialism has no truck with the concept of rights. Rights language is typically found in the ethical theories of Kant and of one for this week, contractarianism. But consequentialism really doesn't rights are incidental, or they are a byproduct of other moral priorities. And that is why, for example, that you have this section on the disadvantages of consequentialism that deals with the problem of justice, because justice is all about rights. And this is the problem that consequentialists have. They have to somehow, or they have to either bite the bullet and say, you know, so much the worse for justice, right? So much the worse for rights. We can do without them. Or they have to modify their theory to somehow also value justice. And of course, that's not part of the consequentialist view. It's about maximizing overall welfare or happiness, if you're a utilitarian. So anyway, I don't know why 37% of you, over a third of you, chose that final one also, but realize that rights really has nothing to do with consequentialism. Okay. Number next is 12. Yes. So we have a true-false. A consequentialist approach to criminal justice, now we were just talking about justice, right? Requires that we punish only those criminals who deserve to be punished. All right, so I'm bending down here because I'm getting my book. So this is the time I'm going to read directly from the book. I want to give you the answer to this one. It's on page 149. The answer here is false. amazingly, only 32% of you got this right. I'm not quite sure why in your reading of consequentialism that the concept of justice and rights was so strong in you, the force is strong in you, that you couldn't detach that concept of justice based on rights from consequentialism. But it's clear that many of you struggled to do that. Anyway, let me give you the relevant passage here from the text. And it's on page 149. And there is a section. I just hold my little book up here. Right there it says, the problem of injustice. Okay? So here's what your author says. To do justice is to respect rights. To commit injustice is to violate rights. If it is ever optimific to violate rights, then utilitarianism requires us to do so. So that's why I say, I said earlier that rights are, disposable in consequentialism. They are, at best, a side effect, if you have a good consequentialist theory. But hey, look, what is of primary importance is selecting the optimific action. And if that requires you to violate rights, then you violate rights. That's what it takes. Now you're going to see in this week's readings when you're talking or when you're reading about ethical pluralism, I think there's one reason that we gravitate to make consequentialism stronger, or not stronger. We gravitate to make consequentialism a more comprehensive theory than it actually is. And so ethical pluralism, if you look at how our effort to find absolute moral rules leads us toward consequentialism when we enter into the problem of moral difficulties or when we have to choose between conflicting moral rules. Anyway, you will see this, and that seems to be, consequentialism seems to be the default view of those who hold absolute moral values. Or you may not be aware that you do, but most people do. All the theories we've been looking at, all of these have to have absolute moral rules at their root. We'll get into that in a little bit. Okay, so this was number 12, I think it was. And yeah, so 32% of you, only 32% of you got this right. Not sure what was up with that. All right, let's go on to number next is 16. Okay, so here we go. This is my, I'm not going to scold, but I will simply remind you that I had given you the exact answers. I had warned you about these two questions, 16 and 17, in the previous video, the Periscope that I did, and then the replay that was available. I warned you about these questions. And sure enough, only 54% of you got this one right. The answer here is false. Utilitarianism holds that when choosing among acts that benefit people, we only have to determine and choose the one that benefits the greatest number of people. No. What is so important to understand about how consequentialism works in maximizing happiness or maximizing well-being is you have to not just look at how much total happiness is produced, you also have to look at how much misery is produced by the same actions. And so what you always are considering then is the net happiness. In other words, here's the happiness amount, here's the misery, and then you subtract the misery from the happiness. That leaves you with the overall happiness, okay? Or the net happiness. That is what utilitarianism, that is what it values. That is what its principle states. So it is not just maximizing or coming to the greatest, I said greatest number, greatest happiness, greatest number of people, right? So no, that's not it either. This is the first misunderstanding that's on page 122, starts on page 122. No, you have to look at the sort of, the overall value of the benefit to the number of people. If you have a very, very, very tiny benefit spread among a million people, you have to weigh whether or not a much higher value benefit to a smaller group of people might be optimific. So that's where you want to be careful of the first misunderstanding. And what I was talking about was this one, the second misunderstanding, which is the greatest amount of happiness. So that's where in consequentialism or utilitarianism, you have to subtract out the misery that a particular action produces from the happiness that it produces to give you the net happiness. Okay, so that's on page 123. And those were the two questions that I warned you about. So I was kind of bummed that that more of you didn't get this one right. However, when I looked at the statistics for the answers on this, I learned something. And I learned that the number of people who got this right or wrong corresponded with the people who watched the video. So it turns out about half the class actually tuned into the video, at least for some of it, and may have had a chance, or at least had a chance, to get to the section in the video where I talked about these questions that I warned you that they were going to be on the quiz. Wow, and sure enough, about half of you missed it, half of you got it right. So again, not scolding, but encouraging you. Make sure that you get the content out of these videos, because I do actually want to give you some help on the hardest problems or the trickiest problems. And yeah, so good for you, those of you who did. I'm glad you did. Hopefully more of you will take advantage of this. All right, here's a long one. This was a multiple choice. This is question number 19, which, by the way, before I go on to this one, I want to say something about question 18. So there was a question about, it gave a definition, and then it asked you, hey, is this act consequentialism or rule consequentialism? And I put the wrong answer choice. I selected the wrong answer choice as correct. And so when I saw only 9% of you got the answer correct, I was like, wait a minute, that can't possibly be. So I looked at it, and sure enough, I had put act consequentialism, but the correct answer was rule consequentialism. So here's what I did. I went in, and of course I corrected the answer in the quiz, and then as far as changing the grade, everyone got credit for it. I mean, that was my mistake, so no one gets penalized for that. So I apologize, I got that one wrong. It does happen, I promise. Okay, so number 19, let's look at this one. We're almost done with the quiz autopsy, and we're going to get on to the content for your upcoming quiz. So which of the following statements is not consistent with the utilitarian view of how to judge the morality of intentions? Now, if you remember your consequentialism is not, the morality of actions in consequentialism is not tied to intention. Okay, so in your text, and I'm going to read again from the text, your answer choice is if you pass up a chance to do an action that would have had better results, you haven't done anything wrong. That is what is not consistent with the utilitarian view of how to judge the morality of intentions. Okay, so let's look at that. I want to point this out to you again, just to confirm that there's a lot of content to these questions. There's a lot of content to the answer choices, and I appreciate those of you who are taking the time to read them carefully, and I know that it takes time to do that. But I do want to reassure you that the wording that I give, although I sometimes alter what's explicitly in the text, almost all of the questions come explicitly from the text. And this is one of those. So I appreciate there's a lot to wade through in a question like this, but the answer is there for you if you've taken good notes and if you even take the time to sort of review the section. All right, so on page 126, I think it is. Did I get that right? Yeah, 126. Right at the end, okay, I'm going to hold this up. So there's a section here called the attractions of utilitarianism, and the answer is the sentence right above that section. So it's at the end of the section that deals with the morality of intentions in consequentialism. And here's what he says. When we pass up a chance to do an action that would have had better results, we are doing something wrong. Always. Okay? That's right from the text. You'll see my wording is slightly different, but that's it. That is drawn right from that spot in the text. It's at the end of a section even. So this one, 57% of you got it right. Not sure what was going on there, But anyway, it was a challenging question, but I just want to reassure you that even on these wordy questions, the answers are there in the text, and I try to be aware of that. I'm not trying to trick you. Okay, and then final one is finally one from the Kantian ethics, which you guys did really well in. The Kantian questions, you really nailed those very, very well. So there was only one that stood out as giving you trouble, and that was question number 27. And it asked, is Kant's perspective on fairness the same as the golden rule? And here, the answer is no, it is not. So this is false, and only 36% of you got this right. And I heard from one of you about why you thought that the correct answer was true. And here's what I learned from that conversation with that student, is that the author sometimes poses a question, a rhetorical question, and he pointed out, for example, that a lot of people, when reading Kant, think that his categorical imperative, for example, is the same thing as the golden rule. It's not, though. He goes on to explain, and he gives two reasons why it's not. What they share, what the golden rule and what Kant's ethics share, is proceduralism. So there's a method for determining what the right action is in a given situation. What Kant disagrees with in the golden rule is that the golden rule bases the justification for our actions is based on our desires, right? So we desire not to be harmed, and so that's the reason we don't harm someone else. For Kant, this is not strong enough, and the fact that it's based in our desires creates problems. I mean, what if our desires are twisted, right? So, and your author goes into some examples of, what that would look like, the case of the fanatic, for example. So the golden rule, although it might be a reasonable rule of thumb, it's an approximation of what Kant is after. Kant's after a more comprehensive and general rule that doesn't allow for those kinds of harmful effects that, depending on who it is that is acting in a way that they don't want to be treated. What if they're a twisted person, right? What if they're a fanatic? That kind of thing. So have a look at that. It's on pages, did I give it there, 161. It goes on to 162 even. And the second reason was, I just blanked on what the second reason was. Well, it's there in the text. So, but the main reason, the first reason was that it's rooted in desires, and Kant wants to root the morality of our actions and fairness in particular on the fact that we are rational and autonomous, that we are agents. Okay. So let's talk about quiz 4. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but I feel like I'm going long again. Let's see if we can get through the content of the quiz. I have some important stuff for you here. I have 3 questions that are a little bit different than your typical true-false, multiple choice, multiple answer, and I've weighted them. I've given them more point value. So what you have are 50 questions total. And one of the questions, the last question, is an essay question. And so the total point value of the quiz is 65. Now this quiz, it counts the same amount for your grade. So it's 20% of your grade, but just like the other quizzes. But the number of points reflects then the content that you are reading. Okay, so what's pretty cool about this section, this section of your reading, is we're wrapping up the normative theories. So we're talking about contractarianism, or social contract theory, and we're talking about ethical pluralism, and that ends then our time in the fundamentals of ethics, and then, just getting a book, then we go to book number 2 for the class, The Ethical Life. So you'll need this for the final one there, chapters 37 through 38, and that's in this book. So the point value for each of those sections is given there. So you'll see that the contractarian theory, which is fairly straightforward, that does consist only of the single point answers, true, false, multiple choice, multiple answer. The ethical pluralism has a higher weighted value, but that's because of the special questions that I have. And then the readings on genetic enhancement, there's the pro article by Sandel, and then there's the anti article by Sandel, who is against genetic enhancement. I'm just going to speak generally. I mean, there are always exceptions to this sort of thing. And then Savulescu is the second article, and his is a pro argument for genetic enhancement of humans. And so the true false part of it, the single point questions are only 10, and then there is an essay question from these readings. So I'm going to get to that here toward the end of the show. Show? Is this a show? I don't know. All right. So the key points from chapters 13 and 14. This is contractarianism, social contract theory. Is you need to understand what defines the participants in the social contract and what are their characteristics. And the three that you will hear or you'll read several times in the text is free, equal, and rational. Those are the characteristics of contractors. Those are the people in the social contract. So you need to understand that term. It's introduced early in the chapter in chapter 13. Okay, next is the prisoner's dilemma. So there's probably 4 or 5 pages on the prisoner's dilemma where he explains what it is, how it works. But the point of the prisoner's dilemma is to show how rational self-interest leads to harmful results. Okay, so we can pursue rational self-interest and avoid cooperation, because it seems that cooperation is in the prisoner's dilemma at least, not in our rational self-interest. And so what is this? What then do we have to do in order to become cooperative? Don't we need cooperation in society? Don't we need to obey the laws and have things like fairness and justice and equality and principles like that in which to live cooperatively? Yeah, it seems we do. All right, so how do we get from what's called the state of nature, where each individual is pursuing rational self-interest, into then a more cooperative society? So the prisoner's dilemma is intended to show what the problem is, and contract theory then gives a solution to this dilemma. It accepts the premises, though, that we are individuals who always are pursuing rational self-interest, and it's right to do so. Okay, so prisoner's dilemma, have a careful read of that. Then you want to look at Rawls' theory, and specifically the veil of ignorance. I've got 3 or 4 questions on that topic. Write the advantages of the theory, of social contract theory. There are multiple advantages that your author goes through, so do have a look at those. And the concept of tacit consent. You need to understand what the word tacit means. And the opposite of tacit, or the contrary of tacit, is explicit. So explicit consent happens like when you physically sign a contract, like if you go to a doctor and you go to the hospital and they want to, or they suggest that you get surgery, then you are presented with a number of forms in which you are asked to give your consent to the procedures that the doctors are going to do, right? So that's explicit consent. You are explicitly consenting by signing your name to a document to enter into this agreement. Tacit consent is not explicit. All right, so you need to understand what tacit consent is and how it works in social contract theory. You've got at least a couple questions relevant there. And lastly, you need to know the scope of the moral community. So who is a contractor? Who is a participant in this society? So in the social contract, what we want to know is who has rights, who is it that deserves respect. We need to know who these people are, who these individuals are. And so you need to understand the scope of the moral community. Who's in and who's out. Okay? Very good. Let me see if I had a note here about that. Nope. Okay. Moving on then. So let's talk then about ethical pluralism. And here's the points that you can focus on in this theory. So first concept you need to understand. You got some vocabulary here. Monism versus pluralism. All right. So this is the chapter on, or 2 chapters on ethical pluralism. So it is something that is fundamentally different than ethical monism. All the theories that we've read up to this point, up to this chapter, have been monistic theories. Now, your author discusses this. Then you need to understand how rules are, moral rules can be absolute and fundamental, or what absolute moral rules are, I should say, and what fundamental rules are. So a monistic theory is one that says that there is a supreme moral rule to which all other moral rules, which can be very, very important moral rules, are justified. So if you want to go and justify a moral rule, say, to pay your taxes, let's just go back to that, then what you have to do, since that is not an absolute or fundamental moral rule, you have to go back and trace it to the moral rule that is properly basic, okay, that is at the root of the theory. Okay, so you need to understand those concepts of the absolute rule and the fundamental rule, what those mean. And the fundamental rule means it's properly basic, that there's no deeper moral rule that you can appeal to. All right, so absolute simply means there are no exceptions to it. So here's the first multi-point question that I want to show you that's on the quiz. So this is exactly, I pulled this exactly from the quiz. So this is what you're going to see. And what you have to do, it's a matching question. And what you have to do then is match the monistic rules to the monistic theories. Okay, so I give you the theories on the left side, and then there's a drop-down box beside each of them where you select the supreme moral rule associated with that moral theory, with that monistic moral theory. Okay, so that's is that 5 or 3? Did I give it? Oh, okay, 5 points. Yeah, because there's 5 theories that I listed there. Okay, so review, in other words, review those definitions for each of those theories so that you can identify that fundamental rule. Okay, good. So back to our list then of topics to focus on. So look at the 3 arguments that are in chapter 15, and that is the argument from disaster prevention, the argument from contradiction, and the argument from irrationality. These are all presented as challenges to an absolutist view of morality. Okay, now I'm going to hit the pause button here for a second because I want you to catch this. Ethical pluralism is a family of moral theories. Some of them also believe that there are absolute moral rules. So just because it's an ethical pluralist theory does not mean that it subscribes to non-absolute moral rules. Okay, so there are 2 different kinds then of ethical pluralism. There's the kind which is focused on in chapter 15, which is pluralism that subscribes to the idea of absolute moral rules. And then in chapter 16, you'll look at an ethical theory a pluralism theory that rejects the idea of absolute moral rules. They are non-absolute moral rules. So it weighs that there are multiple fundamental rules, and that they are sometimes there are exceptions to them. So they are not absolute. All right. So 2 different kinds. Then make sure you catch that, because there's a question on the quiz that asks you to recognize what Ross's theory in particular, we're going to say something about that in a minute, but what his theory rejects. And so you have to recognize that some ethical pluralism allows for absolute moral rules. It's just that there are multiple moral rules. Okay, and some ethical pluralism does not. All right, good. I think I bet that in the ground. Anyway, back to this. So the three arguments then are challenges for any moral theory that has absolute moral rules. And so that can be all monistic theories, that would be all monistic theories, but also ethical pluralism that subscribes to absolute moral rules. Okay. Then you have the tools that absolutists use, or at least two of the tools, excuse me, to respond to try to refute these three arguments. And so they are discussed as doctrines: the doctrine of double effect and the doctrine of doing and allowing. So you want to pay careful attention to those and see how they are deployed in order to respond to, in order to answer then the objections that come from those three arguments. Okay, let's see, I think it's our last thing maybe. So Ross's theory and prima facie duty. So you need to look carefully, and this is in chapter 16, and again, this is, Ross's theory is a non-absolute pluralism. So look at his concept of prima facie duty and how that works and what that is. Okay? So now I want to jump over to another multi-point question. This is a three-pointer, and you are given an argument on the issue of self-evidence in Ross's theory. Okay, so this is a fairly long argument. I think there are 7 propositions in it. And then what I do is give you an analysis of that argument after those propositions. And your job is to figure out how to complete the analysis. The analysis is incomplete. I leave it blank, part of it blank, and then you figure out from a selection, it's a multiple choice, from a selection of phrases that you can plug into that blank, which one makes the analysis correct. Okay, so that's your job in this particular question. So you've got to understand carefully the notion of self-evidence in Ross's theory, and then it asks you to make a distinction in the in subjective self-evidence versus objective self-evidence, which is not in the text. Okay, so this is requiring you to follow an argument that is outside the text but is rooted in, can be understood with the text. All right, so that's your job on that question. And then we have the final question I want to talk about. This is at the very end of the quiz. This is question number 50, and it is an essay question, your first essay question. You know, I've given you a number of questions that are original arguments. I've given you a number of questions that are based on arguments that come directly from the text. And you've had a chance now to see how formal arguments work. I've encouraged you to read carefully that introductory section on moral reasoning and arguments, you know, how they're put together and how you analyze them. And so now your job is to write your own argument. And the argument that I want you to do is to decide which normative theory that we've read, and I give you the list, which normative theory do you think best represents the ethical position that Savulescu takes toward genetic enhancement? Okay, and so here are the instructions for this question. And you are, and again, this is all on the quiz itself, so all I'm doing here is showing you ahead of time what is given to you in this quiz. I just don't want you to be taken by surprise by this. So here you go. Here are the instructions, and I'll just turn over and read them here. So I give you the list of ethical theories from which you can choose. So you choose one of them. Don't say, oh, kind of Kant and kind of consequentialism. No, don't do that. Just choose one. You know, stake your claim on one and give your best argument for that. All right. So your choices are natural law, ethical egoism, consequentialism or utilitarianism, Kantian perspective, contractarianism, and ethical pluralism. So have a look at Savulescu's argument and try to figure out, you know, what is his vocabulary here? And that's the thing that should stand out to you. What kind of language does he use? What kind of moral language does he use? And which theory uses that vocabulary? And which theory supports the use of that vocabulary? So that's a hint to you in helping you decide which ethical theory you think best supports Savulescu's argument. Okay, the next part is really, really important. So let me just read this again slowly. Then explain and support your answer with specific evidence from Savulescu's article. Okay, let me stop for just a second. So it says, then explain and support. So that means the very first sentence you could say in your response can be, I think that, I don't know, ethical egoism is the best ethical theory to explain Savulescu's argument, or something like that. Or that you think Savulescu is taking the ethical egoist perspective on genetic enhancement. Maybe say you want to do that. So just state it. All right, just state what the ethical theory is that you think best supports Savulescu's argument. And that's your first sentence. Okay. Then after that, then you're defending that answer. Okay. So this is where I'm talking about explaining and supporting your answer with specific evidence. Okay. So you need to go into Savulescu's article, and if you've done close reading, then you've done annotating and you've done some underlining and circling and all that kind of stuff. So you've got the content from his article to help you find the evidence that will support your answer. Okay, so you should, here's what I mean by then using specific evidence. You need to explicitly quote something from his, from at least one section or passage from his article. And then you need to cite it. And I give you an example. Sorry, my head's in the way. I give you an example in the next bullet point, how you do that. So I gave there Savulescu 455 through 6. So that's parenthetical citation style, APA. And that's what I'm asking you to do. So you explicitly quote the passage, so using double quotes. Then you put the citation information right after the quote, and then you show how and why it supports your answer. And this is the magical part. This is your argument then. So you are then arguing, and the argument is the defense of the thesis, right? So your thesis is, hey, this ethical theory best supports Savulescu's argument on genetic enhancement. And here's how he does it, okay? And here's why, say, ethical egoism is the best answer. You have to show how and why that answer is supported by Savulescu's argument, by Savulescu's text. One other thing that I should point out that would be helpful to you here is when you are making your selection. No, let me rephrase that. So you've made a selection about an ethical theory. What you need to do in the discussion of your argument is you need to be able to represent that ethical theory accurately. So if I say ethical egoism, or say, so if I make an argument that ethical egoism is the best supporting theory for Savulescu, then somewhere in my discussion, somewhere in the explanation for my answer, I need to be able to make a claim about the egoist position. I need to make sure that I show the reader that I know what ethical egoism says. Okay, so whether that's the fundamental principle or whether it is some related principle in ethical egoism, that needs to appear in my answer. So I need to show that as well. I didn't write that in the instructions, but I do want to point it out. Because what you don't want to do is, let's say it's Kant, and then you talk about things like results or outcomes. That's not Kant, right? So if you're going to say Kant, then you're going to be talking about things like universalizability, and you're going to be talking about the principle of humanity. You're going to be talking about fairness and integrity and autonomy and rationality, all those things, right? Something, and not all of them, but that's the moral universe. The moral universe created by Kant's vocabulary. And so if you think it's Kant, then that kind of vocabulary should be part of your answer. Okay, I hope that's clear. I'm getting animated here. I don't know why I'm so excited about this. But just realize that don't throw the theory out there and then just ignore the content of the theory. That has to be worked into your answer in some way or another. And the most obvious way that be worked into your answer is using the vocabulary, the specific moral vocabulary of that theory. Okay, I think I've said enough about that. All right, let's see. Oh yes, so the final thing is then the answer should be about 200 words. So call it a short paragraph, medium paragraph, call it that, a medium paragraph. So what I encourage you to do is when you go to take the quiz, have your essay done beforehand so that you can just copy and paste it from your word processor or your notepad. Or if you've written out by longhand, just type it. So I really want you to not hurt yourself on the time it takes to finish the quiz by sitting there thinking about your answer and composing it on the fly. By all means, since I've told you what the question is, prepare an answer ahead of time so that you can just copy and paste it. Take the time, to revise it and polish it. I mean, I expect to see that since I'm giving you the question ahead of time. I'm far more interested in reading about something that you've thought about over, a series of hours and days, rather than sort of off the fly, off the cuff essay. This would be much more effective for you and much more interesting for me to read something that you've deliberated about, that you've reflected on. And so, yeah, by all means, prepare your answer to this question ahead of time, and then copy and paste your answer into the text box for the question. All right, I think, are we at the end? We are at the end. Amazing. And it was not quite an hour, but it was pretty close to an hour. Well, thank you all for tuning in. Appreciate those of you who were able to drop in. I know it was kind of an odder time of day than I've done in the past, but this is the best time for me this week. And hopefully all of you can catch this on the replay. And again, I encourage you to please make a note of those questions and those, not just the questions that are going to be coming up on the quiz that I've given you explicit answers to here in the video. Make sure that you review the video carefully to get those. And by all means, good luck on that essay question. Okay. So one last thing is we have one more week after this, and it's all going to be practical moral problems, just like the final two articles that you're reading this week. So this is the fun stuff. This is where we're actually talking about relevant moral problems and sort of how we decide, right and wrong, good and bad in those, using now our philosophical toolkit of the theories that we have at our disposal. So, anyway, I think that's it. I see only one person here. If you have any questions, I suggest that you just drop me a line, drop me an email. I'd be glad to answer them. So until next week, I'll be seeing you to talk about our final week in the course. Can't believe it's already here. But good luck on the quiz, and I'll see you next week.